discussion for you. The first part of which will be me asking the panelists questions. In the usual way of these things, they've been told the questions in advance, and so I'm presuming that they have practiced their spontaneous 5-minute answers. And then there will be time for you to ask questions and make comments yourself. Having looked at the people who are in the audience, we have a lot of expertise in the audience as well. And so I won't only be asking for questions. It rather annoys me when chairs say only questions, and then people make their statements, and then they clearly haven't asked the question, so they have to say at the end, do you agree? And I do expect, if you've got useful contributions to make that are not questions, I would hope that you would feel free to ask to say them. We have people joining online, so I hope they can hear me. And there is an opportunity for people online to ask questions or make comments through the tech, which I am told I will be given all the questions here. It used to be so much easier chairing these things, but we do have the opportunity for people who are online to take part as well. So yesterday we explored the impact of different types of shocks and discussed how governments are preparing and responding to them, largely in the short term. Our focus today is on longer-term strategies for reducing the vulnerability to shocks and for sustaining growth in the face of them. And we're focusing in particular, but not exclusively, on climate vulnerabilities and climate resilience. And we've divided the discussion, we think at least, into 4 particular challenges facing developing countries. One is prioritizing investments for long-term resilience, particularly where they are in some kind of trade-off, whether that's just for resources or attention, with shorter-term needs. How is a strategy put into place and sustained over a period? How do you access external financing for long-term resilience? Is it possible to incentivize the private sector to invest in long-term resilience? And if so, how? And what are the capacities and structures and institutions that will help governments to implement a long-term resilience strategy? We have a really expert panel, and I'm going to just describe the panelists now. I hope the information I've been given is right about them. In the middle is Patricia Roy Akulo, who is social safeguards and gender expert in the climate finance unit of the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development in Uganda. Patricia's work focuses on climate finance mobilization, including gender technical requirements in climate financing engagements. She has over 10 years experience of following the UNFCCC negotiations, poor Patricia, as part of the governments of Uganda delegation, and is one of the finance coordinators of the Least Developed Countries Group. She's a member of the Standing Committee on Finance. My God, I'm feeling even more pity for her now, and represents the 45-member Least Developed Group. Maybe it's more enjoyable than it looks from the outside, the Standing Committee on Finance. Debbie Hillier has more than 25 years of experience in international development, particularly with a focus on adaptation, resilience, disaster risk financing, and gender. She is head of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance Programme, which I presume the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance is the sponsor of your programme in the American way, for Mercy Corps, which you may be familiar with. Debbie leads Mercy Corps programmes in Indonesia, Jordan, and Nepal that measure and strengthen resilience, particularly at the community level, and uses evidence to achieve policy and practice change. And she's also involved in leading influence across the 9 organisations of this alliance. Josue Tanaka, to my immediate left, is another visiting senior, or is a visiting senior fellow at ODI Global, like me, has worked in this field for 40 years. You don't look it, Josue. Starting in Brazil, which is where he's originally from, then went on to the World Bank, where he worked in the strategic planning team, was a special assistant to the president, and developed the environment programme of the Mediterranean, and then moved to the EBRD here in London, where he founded the Climate Finance Initiative, which has become a major part of the EBRD's work, leading to a cumulative, I'm told here, green finance reaching over 42 billion US dollars, with close to 2,000 climate change mitigation adaptation projects. It's really a very significant part of the EBRD's work. And last year, and I think particularly interestingly for our purposes today, Josue was asked to chair the high-level expert group appointed by the Brazilian G20 presidency to look at the vertical climate funds, of which there are, how many?
4, at least the ones that were looked at.
The 4 that were looked at and the 95 that weren't, but the 4 main vertical climate funds and how they could become more streamlined and more effective. And that report, which is a very detailed report, which was produced under the Brazilian G20 presidency, needs implementing, and we will talk a little bit about that today. Our final speaker is on the panel here is Ed Hearn, who is in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, and we're delighted that you've been able to join us here, is a senior economist there, providing technical assistance on a range of public financial management topics, including infrastructure governance and public investment, climate-sensitive PFM and fiscal risks. Previously worked in the Government of Ireland. And we're delighted, and we have the lovely big screen that we can now see. Our final speaker is Neha Sharma, who leads the Results, Impact and Knowledge work at the Adaptation Fund, which is obviously particularly relevant to us today. Neha has over 15 years of experience in climate, environment and development, and is especially interested in systems change and measurement challenges related to these. She was previously at the Climate Investment Funds on leading on evaluation and learning, and has been particularly involved in evaluation programs at the World Bank. So this is quite a panel. And I'm looking forward to extracting their wisdom from them. I'm going to start with you, Patricia, if I may. Thank you very much for joining us from Uganda. Uganda's got a very ambitious plan. It wants to become an upper middle income country by 2040. And yet you are also one of the 20 most climate vulnerable countries in the world, particularly in relation to food security. And quite a lot of severe climate impacts have already hit the country over the last few years, and as always, affect the poorest households the most. And they have becoming more frequent. So the question I wanted to ask you to kick us off is, how do you, as a country, as a government, plan resilience investment? Do you have a strategy that is a resilience investment strategy, or if it's not called that, that effectively has that function? How have you set it up, and how do you prioritize the long-term investment against all the short-term demands that no doubt come to you? And do you have any success in getting the private sector to be involved in such a strategy?
Thank you very much. Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. Again, I'm Patricia Roy from Uganda. And yes, it's true that we are among the 20 most vulnerable countries in the world. Our manifestation of vulnerabilities around flooding, drought, landslides, among others, not so different from some of the countries around us. And it means that we need to prioritize a broad range of resilience investment if we need to safeguard against the extreme impact. So our investment areas in Uganda largely revolves around climate resilient agriculture, because we are largely an agriculture economy. And that means that we need to deal with drought resilient crop varieties that can withstand the shocks. We need to deal with water conservation to maintain productivity, that is largely through irrigation, and also to protect the livelihoods that could rely on nature, like animal production. Our other investment area is around water resource management. So how do we control the flooding, and how do we protect the watershed, and also support irrigation facilities? So you can see agriculture, water conservation efforts, and also resilient infrastructure in terms of are there road resilient infrastructure that we are putting up? Are we having energy resilient infrastructure? For example, the water dams. Sometimes the water dams floods up and you're having a blackout. It then affects the whole chain of productivity, industrialization. So it's one thing making the other go down. So our strategy covers those areas that are quite neatly linked to the economic growth. So what strategies have we set up? So largely, we are mobilizing and looking at blended financing to expand our fiscal space for resilience. So it means that we recognize that public revenue or public finance is not enough, and we need to make sure that we are looking at other sources of financing for the economy. So we are deepening right now the crowding in of private sector investment into our resilience effort. So we're looking at instruments such as blended financing, risk guarantees, green bonds, and resilient linked securities. So this means that we are trying to put in instruments that can attract private sector to invest in climate finance. And there's a whole strategy or structure of how government is running this. Is not yet very well pronounced. And you're all aware that the private sector space is not much grown or big in developing economies, unlike in developed countries. So it's not very easy to attract them into that space. And government has to make trade-offs to make it much easier for them to fall in. And we're also trying to experiment debt for nature swaps. So it means that we are trying to trade off our debts and make sure that we use, instead of paying back the developed economies or the creditors that money, we invest it back for climate action. We've so far done one swap. We want to do, that was a pilot swap. So we gave it a lag, and now we want to start again to undertake certain swaps with governments, say, of France, of Denmark, of Italy, mostly the members of the European Union. It's at very initial stages of engagement. We've reached out to them, and we hope some of this can bring in more financing for resilience. We are trying to also issue bonds. Now, we normally borrow expensive financing, which is commercial financing. And that most means that we cannot save on our public finance. And we realized that if we could try to issue some bonds in the market, sovereign bonds, or green bonds, or whichever bonds, I think it varies from some countries. Some of you have blue bonds. We do not have the blue space. So it means that we can expand on our climate finance ecosystems. And this means that we engage with the private sector definitely. What we are doing at a government level is what we are calling the national budget tagging, climate change budget tagging. It means that as we are doing our national budgeting processes, we have tried to make sure there's allocation for resilience actions and adaptation. So it is deliberate for all government entities as they submit their national budgeting documents to the Ministry of Finance. They have captured allocation for adaptation and mitigation. It is in our third financial year that we're undertaking this. So we think some of these investment efforts will at one point aggregate into not enough, manageable financing for resilience actions. So how we ensure that the private sector is much involved, the government launched what we are calling the National Green Taxonomy last month. The National Green Taxonomy, classification of what actions the private sector can undertake. And in this taxonomy, the government has laid down clear ways to encourage, say, banking or financial institutions or pension funds and insurers to adopt actions and avail concessional financing for interventions. So we have learned this strategy, this taxonomy is going to be managed through the central bank, the Bank of Uganda. And it means every financial entity in the country, and including insurance company or capital markets authority, and all those that are within the liquidity space are engaging with the government deliberately to provide this financing. So we are nearly done with all the structural policy reforms that is needed to attract the financing we need. It is now how we pilot and implement some of them at this point. And again, we are not that bad at implementation. We are making efforts to ensure we achieve all that. So I don't know, how many minutes do I still have?
Let me stop you there. That's a really interesting and comprehensive kind of overview of what you're doing. And we could perhaps come back to some of the specifics later. But I was very interested that you talk about climate budgeting, and I want to ask Ed about this. So you work in public financial management, and I presume that having spent quite a lot of years in it, your first years didn't have any climate budgeting. What in the IMF, how do you think about integrating climate concerns into standard good practice in public financial management?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Well, I mean, I think a recurring theme of yesterday was the importance of robust institutions, robust fiscal institutions, broadly defined, to help engender resilience and a capacity to absorb the types of shocks and crises that we have been talking about. You know, the capacity to have thought about scenarios, to have put in place preventative measures, to have the buffers there. And I think, I mean, you're right about it's a reasonably newer arrival on the scene in terms of climate sensitivity. But before ever we think about that, I think it's really important to say that robust institutions are key to resilience in the first place. And in many ways, good PFM processes are, if you like, the wiring of the overall fiscal institutions. And we see that across the cycle. You know, I think from fiscal frameworks, as I say, having processes in place, preventative measures, rules, assessment of fiscal risks, assessment of scenarios, through to budget frameworks, you know, medium-term frameworks, credible forecasts of revenue, credible forecasts of expenditure, ceilings ideally to bind expenditure within realistic parameters, and then onwards into budget execution. So things like having commitment controls, having procedures in place to try and prevent the buildup of expenditure arrears, having good, transparent public procurement systems, and then again onwards into ex post audit and evaluation. So I think key point here is that before ever we look at layering in other strategic priorities such as climate, the robustness of the institutions and at base the core components of the PFM processes that make that up are I think really central to inculcating resilience. Having said that, we have, as you say, you know, in recent years, added particular climate lens or climate sensitivity to each of those phases. About 3 or 4 years ago, colleagues published a paper and a how-to note about how to effectively green public financial procedures. And in that, they identified a number of what they called entry points. So how we think about climate, again, across the cycle, from strategic planning and fiscal policy, how we link in things like consistency with nationally determined contributions, national mitigation plans, budget preparation, thinking about things like mainstreaming of climate and reflecting climate mitigation and adaptation concerns in budget call circulars. Obviously tagging and identifying of climate favourable and climate harmful expenditure is also something that's become quite popular, and looking at execution and reporting of climate. Within that then, or at least in support of that, much of our technical assistance has focused on developing specific tools for how countries go about mainstreaming these issues. One is called QCraft, which is a snazzy acronym that I can't really remember what it stands for, but it's something to do with quantitative and risk and climate. But it's effectively a tool that tries to anticipate the range of potential scenarios, the climate impact on macro parameters such as GDP and debt and deficits and so forth, and assess under various scenarios what the likely outturn is likely to be. I understand, I think Uganda has been through this process, and many other countries as well have used this tool. We have also done more work to look at how climate considerations are reflected in public investment management. And if you happen to ask me a spontaneous question about that later on, I will return to that topic.
I've got another spontaneous question I'm going to ask you that you haven't prepared.
Okay, very good. And also then looking at other things like, as I say, climate budget tagging and reporting and tracking of budget execution. So I guess the key point is that resilience is at the core, or sorry, PFM processes, well-defined PFM processes are at the core of resilience, broadly defined. And then there's more we can do to assess the climate sensitivity on top of it.
So my unprompted question or unprepared question is about and you are the IMF, so we all want to push you, which is on debt sustainability analysis. And the reason I'm asking this particularly is because I've been involved with ODI Global in an exercise called the Expert Review on Debt, Nature and Climate, who's looking at the relationship between debt, nature and climate. And one of our key recommendations is on the debt sustainability analysis that you, as the IMF, will the World Bank use, and its relative failure, because it's not entirely absent, but or inadequate acknowledgement of climate risk on both sides of the equation, meaning the additional risks that come from increased and more severe climate impacts, but also the economic benefits, therefore, that come from resilience spending. And by and large, it is true to say the IMF and World Bank in the DSA, Debt Sustainability Analysis Framework, they've got a little bit now of acknowledgement that there are additional risks, but almost no acknowledgement that in the context of those additional risks, resilient spending has huge economic returns. And in practice, if you don't have that, you are under incentivizing, let's be as nice as possible, countries to invest in that because they gain no credit in the DSA. Though you're not in that team, so I'm not expecting you to talk. But I just wondered whether you're conscious of this on the PFM side, of the way in which the debt sustainability analysis, which the IMF does, effectively penalizes or at least doesn't reward countries for doing the resilience that you are hoping that they will show up in their PFM work. Would you like to take that?
Yeah, no, look, as you say, I don't work on that side of the house, but I understand the point you're making. I think on the PFM side and on technical assistance generally, we absolutely do try and look as broadly as possible at the potential benefits. We have discrete tools that look at particular aspects of risk analysis, and I mentioned the QCraft. But on the expenditure side, in particular, when it comes to our technical assistance, which again is a very separate thing, on our technical assistance, we are keen to stress, the range of potential benefits to enhanced resilience and the potential return on resilience expenditure. But I think it's still evolving, and I think as we look at, as we will. A lot of what we've done so far has focused on, if you like, the institutional design of PFM measures and not yet fully assess their effectiveness. And I think as this area evolves, that will absolutely be something that we will turn to and dedicate more of a focus on. And in doing so, I think we will probably have to look as broadly as possible, and then obviously feed in throughout the organization on our view as to how we see these issues evolving and what the implication might be for obviously the other areas of the fund's work.
This question of how you measure the return on resilience investment seems to me to be absolutely central to this whole conversation. So we will come back to it with the panel and also with people, I hope, in the audience, because if we don't properly understand the return on resilience investment, it becomes a nice to have, which everybody says, oh yes, we must be more resilient, but it's very hard then to evaluate it against all the other things which you might do. And there may well be trade-offs, both temporal trade-offs, but also goal trade-offs. So perhaps that's something we could come back to. Debbie, I want to turn to you. You've got a lot of experience in disaster risk reduction and response, which I presume earlier in your career was not so much about climate, and now a lot of that is about climate. So what, in your experience, what are the obstacles, what are the biggest obstacles that countries face when they're trying to think about climate resilience strategies, and what do development partners such as yourselves do to help them?
And that is a very big question. But I think, yeah, from my experience, I think a lot of adaptation, resilience, DRR, however you describe it, it really needs to be locally led. And I think this is a slight difference with climate mitigation. Solar panels will provide predictable returns pretty much anywhere in the world. But I think for adaptation and resilience, to be sustainable, at least, and to be successful, they need to be very context specific to the hazard, to the community. They need to take into account kind of indigenous knowledge and the needs of the vulnerable in that community, which makes them, frankly, harder to scale and less attractive to the private sector. So that is one of the key issues that is very difficult to deal with. And then I think looking more at the finance, I think there are three things that are needed in terms of finance in relation to resilience. We need quantity, we need quality, we need access. Now, I think my other colleagues on the panel are going to talk about access, so I will leave that one. But in terms of quantity, I think, there is no doubt that there is a finance gap in terms of DRR adaptation, however you describe it. Certainly, I work most on adaptation now. So broadly speaking, adaptation finance needs are around 300+ billion a year. And that's going up, obviously, as climate impacts are continuing to bite. And it's becoming more and more important. And at the moment, international climate finance is around 32 billion and probably going down. So it's clear there's a massive adaptation finance gap. So that's the how much. And in terms of the how, the quality, that's equally important. And there's different ways of looking at this. And actually, ODI are coming out with a report very soon on the fair share of climate finance, looking at quality as well as quantity. But vulnerability, is it going to the most vulnerable countries? Broadly speaking, no, it is not. It is going to more middle income countries and not those that are most climate vulnerable, and certainly not those that are most fragile. In terms of GESI, gender equality and social inclusion, does it look at those issues? Again, broadly speaking, no. Less than half of that. We did some analysis a couple of years ago. Less than half of the adaptation projects actually have GESI objectives within them. And then concessionality, picking up a point both of you guys have made around debt and loans. 70% of all climate finance is loans, and a lot of that is not concessional. I find this absolutely shocking. So it means that developing countries are paying twice, once to repair or deal with a problem they didn't cause, and then a second time the debt servicing that limits their ability to then develop further and invest in resilience. Oxfam and CARE came out with a report just last week around, they call it the finance shadow report, finding that for every $5 in climate finance, developing countries pay back 7 because of this non-concessionality of a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it is not concessional. So in terms of how development partners can support countries, there's clearly a need for technical assistance, I think, for countries to deal with the inherent complexity of resilience. So that could be data, that could be analysis, that could be, developing some kind of project plans. So as an example, I was in Nepal a few months ago talking to the government there about extreme heat. The government there is very used to dealing with earthquakes and very used to dealing with flooding. There's more to do, but nonetheless, they understand the risks. I think extreme heat is a new risk for them. And so they're trying to figure out how to respond to this. Should they focus on food? Should they focus on agriculture, livelihoods, health? Where do they focus? And they need support in developing the analysis around that. Similarly, in Indonesia, another place where we work, the government there is dealing with permanent coastal inundation. So lots of communities that can no longer live where they live because essentially the sea is coming in. These are very real problems, and support is needed to help them deal with these problems. So that's the need for kind of TA, but we can't get away from this funding gap. So grants and highly concessional loans, adaptation does need to be funded fast and fair, and COP30 could have a role to play in that. I do understand we're in quite a tricky aid situation at the minute, but there are some solutions, and I'm happy to come back to that in the Q&A later.
Thank you very much. This then raises a really interesting question. You say that disaster risk, traditional disaster risk, because we've had quite a lot of years, we've built up experience, and although all resilience is local, there has to be some transferability of knowledge and so on. But what we're now dealing with climate risk is risk that is changing all the time. So it isn't a solid body of knowledge that we've inherited on what happens when you have an earthquake or whatever. And the extreme heat that Nepal is new, and it's new for Nepal, but it's also new everywhere, and it's changing. So the amount of the frequency of extreme heat events and so on. So this is much more difficult, I think, because we don't have a solid body of knowledge that can be transferred from one country, and the knowledge is itself still developing. And so I'm maybe again in the panel and the discussion with the audience, we can talk about people's experience of understanding of the science, understanding the science, of using local knowledge, not just kind of imported scientific knowledge and so on. So this seems to me to be a really interesting feature of this field, that we don't know enough about the risks that we're dealing with, and they are changing every year, and the information about them. Neha, couldn't we have Neha on the screen? Because I want to ask you a question about the Adaptation Fund. Hello, I hope you can hear us. The Adaptation Fund has been in existence since 2007. So coming up to 20 years, and always claims to be very innovative in its approach to climate financing in adaptation and resilience. Can you tell us a bit more about how you do that? How do you work with countries to identify the resilience strategies that they need and the capacity they need to deliver them?
Thank you, Michael, for the question, and thank you to ODI for inviting me. And sorry I can't be there in person. I'm in Bonn, Germany for our board meetings that are ongoing this week. You know, the question you're asking about capacity building and measurement, maybe I'll just start by saying a sentence about what the Adaptation Fund is. We are only a grant-based funding mechanism, and we have projects in over 100 countries, over about 200 projects across the gamut of adaptation interventions. So it includes water, agriculture, disaster risk, and so on. But we really pioneered the direct access mechanism, which means that countries can access Adaptation Fund grants directly without having to go through multilateral entities, for example. So we have accredited national and regional entities that can access this money. And the accreditation process itself is a capacity building exercise because it involves setting up fiduciary, environmental, and social standards to be able to access that finance. To support the readiness of the entities to access this money, there's also a readiness program that I know that most people here would know that the Adaptation Fund and the GCF have, and we collaborate on this program so that we're not overlapping in our efforts. But the readiness program is about making sure that these institutions have the systems that are needed to manage the funding, that the projects that they're proposing are aligned with their national strategies and their national goals, as stated in the NDC NAPs and other national development plans. But also it's about knowledge exchange and learning. So making sure that countries have the access to the knowledge and the data that they might need to then have impact down the line. And I really appreciated Debbie bringing up locally led adaptation and sort of the tension almost in that adaptation efforts are going to have to be local. But of course, the devolution of finance to that level tends to be tricky, and access to finance at the local level is tricky. However, we have a special locally led adaptation window, and we are really advocates for that type of financing to make sure that we're following LLA principles, locally led adaptation principles, which include devolution of finance to the lowest level possible. So we have a special window trying to advocate for that type of finance, and just accessing it and then using it, and through our monitoring processes, there's a lot of capacity build. So there's extensive capacity building opportunities through learning grants, through readiness grants, and so on. There's a lot of peer-to-peer exchange and knowledge sharing, but in just accessing the funds and going through the processes, there's a lot of capacity development. I'll just add a little bit on our monitoring and measurement systems. And Michael, I really, as a measurement professional, I really appreciated your push on what are we measuring and how and why and why does it matter? Which is of course easier for a fund like a climate fund, because our measurement systems really look at adaptive management, for example. There's a lot of flexibility in these systems to change the course midway, given the contextual changes, new risks that are emerging, for example. So while there's annual monitoring and annual targets that need to be met, there's a lot of flexibility built into the system to change this and to adapt to changing circumstances. And even with MEL systems, there's capacity development that happens along the way. So the Adaptation Fund, for example, has proactive, we're about to start a proactive help desk function, for example, for entities that are looking at measurement issues so that we can support them. And it's not just technical work that's coming from the Adaptation Fund to our partner countries, but it's also country-to-country exchange. So learning from each other on how measurement challenges for resilience are being addressed. We're going to start some work on the use of AI and measurement. How can we support the countries to build data availability through new ways of collecting data that are emerging? And in all of this work that I just shared, we're trying to work more with other funds because as Joshua knows really well in the report that he was leading, there's a lot of work there as well to be done in the funds, talking to each other and making sure that access is streamlined and easy, and that we're not creating duplicative work, duplicative processes, and making the lives of our partner countries harder. And we're doing that work also on the results and measurement side. I'll stop there, but I could go into more detail on anything that I've said, but maybe
Okay,
for now.
well, I will ask you for a bit more detail, and people in the audience may also do so. We're talking at a very general level at the moment, and I'm keen to get us focused on specifics as well. But these are the questions we want to start with. Kind of what's the general picture here, but kind of the specific kinds of investments that we're talking about and the needs of this. But just where you. I hope this isn't embarrassing, that because we have a representative of the Adaptation Fund, and you were the person who reviewed all the funds last year. And the reason that the Brazilians asked for a review of the funds is a sense that they might, let's put it this way, they might be able to be streamlined, improved, become more efficient, perhaps work together a bit better. What were the main findings of your report?
Well, first of all, you made quite a selection of having, the Adaptation Fund in this particular panel, because when we did the work, I mean, just also to explain, what did we look at? So we looked at 4 funds, right, including the Adaptation Fund, but also, I would say, the grandmother or grandfather of these funds, which was the Global Environment Facility, then the Climate Investment Funds, which works with the MDBs, and finally, the Green Climate Fund. So these were the 4 funds. Now, I say this smiling that, you did a nice selection of having the Adaptation Fund, because one of the findings we found actually was that the Adaptation Fund, and Neha, I don't say that just because you're on screen, but was the most loved of the funds, when we looked around. But, if I link back to Debbie's point about quantity, quality, and access, one has to say it's a bit of an illustration of small is beautiful, if you remember that old book from 60 years ago, right? It's loved, but it's also incredibly small. And also from a funding point of view, I don't need, you having your board, so good luck, right? But the point is that, on the funding side, it's not easy every day, for the Adaptation Fund. So we looked at these 4 funds. Indeed, what the G20 Brazilian presidency wanted to look at was particularly, I would say, how to respond in an analytic way to, I would say, a growing frustration, with these funds, particularly then to another dimension of what Debbie mentioned, which is access, right? That yes, these funds exist, but, many of them are quite difficult, to get through, takes a lot of time, etc. And, if I get to the last dimension you mentioned about quantity, I think also, it is fair to say that, in terms of the size of the climate challenge, these funds are, in terms of quantity, very small, right? So this was the premise, of the work. And so in terms of how we analyze this, we did it in 5 levels. So very quick, we had to look at the global level, because Michael, in a way with his usual humor, mentioned 94 other funds. Probably you could say actually there are probably more than 100 other, climate and environmental funds that exist around. Every time there is an issue, people think, let's create a fund. Very inefficient, right? Because each time, you need to create a governance, you need to, and, you go to certain treasuries and they seem to be traveling every day, to a fund, the board of another fund. So not very efficient. So we tried to put that, and the key message there was, if you have another climate or environmental issue, please try to use a structure that exists rather than invest, into a new creation. But again, the power of announcements, of media, of having an announcement, that one I cannot say we've managed to deal with. Okay, second point, because of the quantity issue, mobilization is very important, right? So in other words, because these funds, what are we talking about these days? 4 to 5 billion, perhaps a year, altogether, very small, even if you take that 300 billion number just for adaptation, you can see, how limited. So how do they mobilize is key, right? And therefore, we did a set of recommendations, linked, to how these funds could, enhance their mobilization, both in terms of public and private resources, right? The third level that we looked at was really that, imagine these funds didn't exist, none of them. And we started de novo with a blank sheet of paper. Would we create 4 different funds? Question mark. I don't ask you to respond to this. But, the answer is probably no, right? That, you would not go, for 4 funds, which have distinct mandates, but also have a lot of overlaps, right? So we did look, at the full range there of, do nothing, which is the comfortable position, don't disturb a thing, all the way to consolidation, put all this together. We did feel that the last one, we would probably spend more time in shenanigans, of political and bureaucratic considerations. And given what's happening on the climate front, was probably not the best use of time, right? So what we came out with was really ways for the funds to coordinate, their action together. Then the next level, so we're reaching level 4, was a beautiful word, but an impossible one in practice. So who can resist? I'm looking at these beautiful leaves and trees outside. Who can resist? Harmonization. As a word. So how can you, for a country that has often limited capacity, how can you avoid having project approval? Each of them has a different form, each of them has a different way to do this. Accreditation, process is different, etc. So what can we do in that area, right? So that was level 4. And level 5 was really getting then into the nitty-gritty of things with 3 topics in particular on focus. One was accreditation. It is fair to say that for some of the funds, some countries or some companies or some institutions actually gave up, right? It took so long, to go through that they said, okay, we give up, right? So what can you do, to avoid, that? The second point on accreditation linked with the harmonization was also, can we think, I look at Neha here because that's something that's been talked about right now, is if you have accreditation in one of the funds, could it be? Yeah, that's a revolutionary question. Could it be actually okay for the other funds, right? So that, again, from a country point of view, would help, right? Or from an institution point of view, would also help. So that was the first question we looked at, accreditation processes, a really fascinating field for anyone who wants to go into this. The second one was project approval processes, because again, sometimes in some of these funds, it took, close to forever, to get, So the funds have been doing a lot of work to try, to reduce those periods. And the third one, it's the one that people often forget because we always talk about commitments, investments, when you open the champagne bottle to say how glad we are, to sign this loan agreement. But that's not enough because you don't achieve anything unless you get to disbursements in implementation, right? And so you also had this issue in the funds, which is how long does it take once you do have the champagne ceremony, to actually have a result on the ground. So these were the 5 levels that we worked in. Because of time, I'll stop here. But if you want to know what has happened, it's a bit like, in a TV series in the next episode.
Or the next whole series, I think, probably. The next thing that should happen is that the institutions that you've reviewed should be required to implement your proposals, and so that's something which may well emerge in the next few weeks in the roadmap, which is being designed by Brazil and Azerbaijan. You mentioned these 4. There's another one on the blog, which is over the last few years, the IMF has created the Resilience and Sustainability Facility. Originally a trust and then a facility underneath, which is larger than all of these put together, and has slightly gone under the radar, it seems to me, for many climate people. But it's a fund created out of the reallocated SDRs, which were issued in 2021. And I wanted to ask you, Ed, about the RST. What is it spending its money on? How do you disperse? How does that relate to your wider fund financing packages, and how does it relate to these other financing mechanisms like the adaptation fund?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it's gone under the radar for those countries that have already, benefited, but I take your point. So, I mean, I guess broadly, this was set up in 2022. I'm no expert in the mechanics of the fund, but it provides longer-term affordable funding for countries that are particularly vulnerable. In fact, a large share maybe the majority of the IMF member countries are actually eligible for this. Conditionality in terms of the design and so forth has focused on a number of areas. There's disbursements are linked directly to the achievement of particular reform measures, which which relate to across a number of areas, things like fossil fuel reform, things like subsidy reform, sectoral mitigation strategies. And in particular, if we step back to the title of this session around investing for resilience, there's been a large linkage to steps to improve the climate sensitivity of public investment within countries. So as part of that process, we have done a large breadth of TA around public investment management right back to about 2015. And that was in response to the fact that analysis that we did showed that many countries lose an awful lot of the potential impact of their public investment through poor governance practices. So public investment is not being converted into infrastructure assets at the rate that it ought to. And in particular, if countries, bridge some of these governance gaps, they could close the gap with the highest performing countries. So as part of that, we designed a new diagnostic framework called the Public Investment Management Assessment. And in 2021, we added to that a particular climate focus, so Climate Public Investment Management Assessment. And through that, we look at how climate issues, mitigation and adaptation are being reflected across the full public investment life cycle in place within countries. So that starts at the planning phase, the extent to which climate issues are reflected in national and sectoral strategies, in things like building codes, in things like land use policy, onwards then into coordination, how climate public investment is coordinated within central government, between central government and subnational government, and between central government and state-owned enterprises. We also look very closely at how climate issues are being reflected in project appraisal and project selection. I think in reference to your earlier question about how we consider the counterfactual of investment in resilience, I think that's really important, and there's an important role there for how project appraisal mechanisms are set up, how projects are selected, how ultimately countries' public investment portfolios come to be formed, and how things like climate-related risk is allocated in PPP contracts. The framework also looks at budgeting and portfolio management and how climate is reflected in those, and also risk assessment and some of the questions that we heard yesterday around having arrangements in place for disaster preparedness and so forth. So we have undertaken that diagnostic in about 60 countries. We've done the PIMA about 100 times. Sometimes we have returned to a country to see how progress has been in the interim period. As I say, the climate diagnostic has been done about 60 times, and most or all of the RSF countries have had a climate PIMA diagnostic, which has been very central in informing conditionalities. So these have related to things like introducing climate related appraisal for public investment projects, enhanced tagging and tracking of expenditure, enhanced strategies for asset management and understanding the impact of climate on public investment assets, infrastructure assets, and also thinking about maintenance, how climate change will have an impact on how countries need to maintain their stock of public assets. So we continue to do this work. As I say, we've done about 60. We have a number of other countries on the horizon. It's not just been low-income countries. We've also deployed the framework in a number of advanced economies, including the UK. It was one of the first countries to have a CPIMA back in 2021. And we will continue to refine that framework as well. I mentioned earlier about the effectiveness of these processes and institutions. So in our overall public investment management assessment framework, we consider two aspects of how countries go about public investment throughout the cycle. One is institutional design, what's happening on paper, and the other is institutional effectiveness, what's happening in practice. Unfortunately, we see a gap between those. It seems to be narrowing in certain countries, but the extent to which practices on paper are being reflected in practice has a way to go yet. We haven't yet started to assess that for the climate public investment management assessment. That was in recognition of the fact that many countries are at an early stage in implementing these reforms. So the decision was taken to allow that to bed in and then turn to effectiveness later on. But that is certainly something that we are going to start doing now in the next wave of assessments.
The RST was about 42 billion, is that?
Yeah, or a little more.
A little more.
Yeah, more.
And how much of that has been dispersed? Do
Do
you know?
I don't have the figure off the top of my
Tom,
head.
do you know?
Maybe around 25.
Somebody look it up. About half so far.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe a little more. There was a
Little
paper
more.
by ODI last year, but I don't have the exact up-to-date figure.
Yeah. We can look it up. Let's move this on. I'm conscious of time. I do want to give people time from the audience. Let's just look at the private sector. Debbie, you've got some experience. The private sector did a report. Mercy Corps did or the Alliance, the Climate Resilience Alliance, was a bit negative about the role of the private sector, particularly in the adaptation field. What did it say?
So yeah, interestingly, I wouldn't describe it as negative.
It wasn't negative, but it was interesting.
Yes. And I think that's what we wanted. We wanted something that's actually based on evidence. We hear so much about the role of the private sector, particularly now when there's very little public finance out there. So the private sector can pick up the gap. And we really want to know, well, what is the potential of the private sector? And there is no, before our work, there was no analysis already out there. So we did some original research. We used Paul Watkiss and his associates who do the Adaptation Gap Report. They have access to the Adaptation Gap Report database, which has information by sector, by country, like huge amounts of very disaggregated data. We use an OECD typology of looking at what kinds of actions are likely to be public funded or what's commercially viable and therefore the private sector can take it. What's a public good? Think of, coastal protection. That's in very rare circumstances will that be privately funded. So things like that are much more likely to be publicly funded. And then what's kind of in between. So huge amount of analysis, quite unique. And the headline kind of stat out of this is that 15 to 20% of adaptation funding needs could come from the private sector. Now, note, this is not including household kind of adaptation, and it's not including private sector adapting itself, so making its own infrastructure. So it's not including that. It's focused on kind of the public priorities for adaptation, so the kind of things that you'd find in national adaptation plans. So that's the kind of 300+ billion a year. So 15 to 20% of that could come from the private sector. So is that negative? I don't think so, because at the moment it's 3%. So at the moment we've got 3, we could get to 15 to 20%. So I think that shows a kind of potential and a progression.
Kinds of things with the private sector fund. Where are the returns?
So the biggest sector by far is agriculture. So that's where, and that is obviously a lot of private companies are doing agriculture. Clearly, though, it's mostly in the commercial sector to the big commercial farmers. So not really helping most of the 500 million smallholder farmers around the world. So the space in agriculture, also in water and infrastructure. And there's certainly more space in middle-income countries, particularly upper middle-income countries. There's just more potential for the private sector. There's less perceived risk, possibly actual risk. So that number, 15 to 20%, is higher in upper middle-income countries and lower in LDCs and SIDS, where the potential is just less. But even to get to the 15 to 20, that will need public finance as well to de-risk that, to use some of the blended finance that Patricia was talking about. We did also look at blended finance, actually, and I think there's this kind of perception that, a tiny bit of public money will crowd in all of this public money. The stats don't actually show that to be the case. So we did some stats on the Convergence database, which is a sort of pro-blended finance network. And we found that of the adaptation projects, $1 of public concessional funding crowds in 57 cents of private. Now, that's not nothing, right? That's not nothing, but it's not that kind of big numbers that I think people often think about. Now, Patricia, I'm not talking about your projects. They may be different, but that was the kind of analysis that we did of that database. So, there is a role for the private sector. There absolutely is, and particularly for middle-income countries and for certain sectors. But we can't expect it to pick up the funding adaptation in other places. It just can't. It just won't. MDBs obviously do have a role to play, and then we get into the whole conversation about loans again. Again, perhaps that's okay for middle-income countries, but not for LDCs and SIDS and highly indebted countries. So again, back to public finance. We also looked at in the national adaptation plans, some countries also say how much of that funding they are likely to, how much of their funding needs they're likely to provide themselves from their own domestic resources, and how much is conditional on funding from elsewhere. And so across the NAPs, countries say, this is obviously self-reporting, that 16% of their adaptation needs will be met by domestic resources. So again, that's not nothing. But still a lot of funding still left then for the international public sector.
I think the finding of 57 cents on a dollar of in leverage is very similar to numbers that the ODI has generated for blended finance in general, and it does give the lie, or at least it casts some doubt on the kind of billions to trillions kind of language, the vast sums of private finance which are expected to flow. At least the developed countries saying, the 1.3 trillion, much of it can be made up of private sector. That's an awful lot of leverage to generate large private sector funds. That's an awful lot of public funds that would be needed to do that. And so that's, and I'm interested, Patricia, when I come back to you in a second, kind of, what your experience is of exactly how much public money you need to get the small amounts of private. And maybe I can ask you first, Neha, on this. The Adaptation Fund presumably has been trying to get public-private partnerships in various of your funds. You want to leverage private finance. What's been your experience of doing that, particularly in the infrastructure field? How much private sector? What's your leverage ratio?
Can I misbehave and
Yeah.
make just a little mini point?
You absolutely may.
Because I think it's an important point that probably many in the room think about. One of the challenges in all this is that on one hand, you have a push towards adaptation and increasing adaptation, including on these funds, but also on the MDBs, on many of the actors in this. On the other hand, what you have is also this push on private sector mobilization, right? And how to articulate that is not so obvious, right? Because, if you look overall, you mentioned the 1.3 trillion. If you look at mitigation in renewables in, large middle-income countries, it ought to be essentially a private sector play, right? Without even leverage. Right, without the need, for blended finance. So if you look at the overall equation, if you want on adaptation mitigation, I think, we have to look, at this tension, which becomes very hard, for example, for some of these funds or for some of the development agencies, for example, because they're being pushed in both directions, right? Now, if you say, oh, I prioritize private sector mobilization, then guess what? You may be doing less, in fragile states, you will be doing less in adaptation and resilience, etc. If you do more on these areas, then your mobilization ratio will fall out. So again, I'm sorry to be impolite and come in like this, but I just thought, this is a key, when you think about the famous 1.3 trillion, that's, part of the tension in there, particularly for certain of the actors in the game. Sorry, Neha, you're...
No, no, I'm glad you came in because I think you've...
Go on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. No, I was just saying, I'm glad you came in because and I wish even earlier I'd spoken after you, Joshua, because I wanted to respond to a few things that you said about the climate funds. Now, having worked at 2 of the 4 that you were looking at in that report. But one thing I'll reframe is, you said earlier that that it's a challenge for the adaptation fund to raise money. I just say it's a challenge for adaptation funding in general, as we're all saying in the panel, and we all know really well. And especially because even the NCQG that's calling on now more the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, that's setting an ambition for manifold finance in both adaptation and mitigation, and recognizing the importance of public, bilateral, private, and alternate innovative sources, is also recognizing that adaptation finance will have to remain public, grant-based, and highly concessional. So, that's just a given. And I also wanted to mention before I forget that, Debbie, the work coming from your shop is being used a lot by our board. So I've heard that report quoted multiple times, including the ODI work, in having this conversation about innovative financing. And innovation, calling that financing innovative itself is being debated by our board. And I was previously last week at the Global Goal on Adaptation negotiations and hearing those conversations. And again, what is innovative, what isn't, and what does that mean for adaptation finances is really a big discussion. Now coming back to the question that you were asking, Michael, I won't speak necessarily on leveraging ratios for the adaptation fund on private sector, because we're fully grant based. And though we have some experimentation on the private sector, we provide a lot of grant based to government. And to LLA at the local level. But I'll share, as an evaluation professional, what I found reading a lot of reports on what's effective in bringing in more private sector investments or other types of financing beyond public money. And maybe three things, and Ed was speaking a lot about this, but that technical assistance piece and that capacity building at all levels, including at the project preparation and early stage, is really an important piece of that puzzle. So this includes feasibility studies, financing those type of risk screening, environment and social assessments. The robust upfront planning and the technical assistance required there has been critical to build up the government capacity, but also look at other sources of financing downstream. I wanted to mention this facility in Kenya, for example, financing locally led climate action program, I think FLOCA, which is about locally led adaptation and providing technical assistance upfront for that project preparation phase, as something that we think is a good model. And of course, I've mentioned before the readiness program of the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. The second point I wanted to mention was investments that are creating an enabling environment for policy and regulatory progress, and in preparing the necessary infrastructure for example, to become insurable downstream. So in Antigua and Barbados, for example, we did an integrated infrastructure program, which is looking at building resilience to impacts of flooding and hurricanes through climate proofing homes, restoring wetlands, establishing storm shelters. And these interventions made this infrastructure insurable once the interventions had taken place. So inviting more market-based and risk transfer mechanisms once the infrastructure was insurable was like another way in which public money or grant money was then facilitating bringing more private sector money downstream. We have an innovation window at the Adaptation Fund that's also looking at funding novel approaches for this upstream type work, but extending to nature-based solutions, digital technologies, or new business models that could be used and experimented with. And then the third point I wanted to bring in is that because a lot of the conversation and adaptation is about adaptation finance, we forget about the knowledge and technology transfer aspects. I mean, it's enshrined in the Paris Agreement. It's part of a big discussion, and where the private sector, I think, has a big role to play. And it's not just the private sector, and it's not just knowledge transfer from developed countries to developing countries, but between developing countries. And there are a lot of platforms that are coming up to do this well. And here, I think the climate funds and multilateral organizations have a big role to play in facilitating some of this knowledge and technical know-how. There's a big discussion yesterday in our board on South-South partnerships and exchanges and how we might be able to facilitate that more, for example. And then I'll just end by saying, because your question also had this element of partnerships, I do agree that the climate funds need to work more together. There are a lot of ways in which this is happening. Joshua, you mentioned accreditation as one of those, fifth level sort of fine-tuning areas. And we know that the GCF is undergoing a review of their reaccreditation processes. The Adaptation Fund is looking to align to that process as well. There's already fast-track accreditation for any entity that's accredited by the GCF. And in all of this, the scaling up of interventions is really important, because we're saying that the Adaptation Fund is small, but really the adaptation funding, as I said before, is small. And we need to look at more scale-up opportunities, even if it's a project of one fund being scaled up by another. And we're developing a scale-up framework between the adaptation and the GCF at the moment. So I hope I answered your question, but I also wanted to react to a few things that were said that triggered
My
some
question has
emotion.
several others. So thank you. The point that you make about resilience investments enabling insurance, and that being, you can see that as actually a way of mobilizing, of leveraging private funding, is a very interesting one. And again, excuse me, again, it kind of raises the question of the return on resilience investment. That's a very interesting aspect. Lastly, on the panel, and then we're going to move to Q&A. I just wanted very quickly, Patricia, just if you talk a little bit about capacity. Has bringing climate resilience investment into the public spending framework in Uganda required new capacities, new institutional forms, or new skills? Is this something which has proved difficult to do with the existing structures and people, or have you adapted quite well yourselves, as it were, to the new field?
So I must say for the start that we have done good preparatory work in terms of enabling policy framework. First of all, to say that Uganda has institutionalized climate finance mobilization by setting up a climate finance unit. That means also disaster risk finance mobilization. So as a Ministry of Finance with the mandate to mobilize financing, we have set the pace. And it has meant that we needed to support the executing ministries to also to be able to come up with to align to the aspirations of the Ministry of Finance to mobilize. So we still have definite challenge in terms of institutional capacity strengthening for the say executing ministries responsible say for disaster implementation engagements. So it has not been that smooth, but the enabling framework and the will from the Ministry of Finance, as of course the core entity in terms of availing financing, has been good. So it makes it not too difficult for the executing ministries, but rather for them to simply align faster to ease the work of the Ministry of Finance. But still, in terms of financing available to support the alignment of those ministries, that's still a challenge. We have the limited concessional financing to provide for them. The government makes effort to provide through the budgeting processes. The government makes effort to find financing from all other sources, but it can never be enough because the shocks keep coming in and up and in bigger magnitude. And it means that we cannot align fully to the efforts because the financing doesn't match up the need. So that's where there's a bit of a dislink, despite the goodwill. So I think for us, it's important to know that resilience is not a standalone phenomenon. As a country, we have had to mainstream resilience or climate action across all our fiscal management framework, but also align it to the performance of all ministries, because everything else is tied to resilience ability of the country. I think that's what I would like to say. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Let's turn it over to all of you. Questions, comments. I think I'm going to take a range of them, a few, and then we don't need to answer. We absolutely do not need to answer all of them with all the panelists, but we'll see what responses come from the panel. So questions or comments. Do we have a roving mic, or do we need? There is one over there. So, gentlemen here. Yes, why don't you take the mic? In fact, two, I think, yes, there are two sitting next to one another who would like to ask questions. So let's start with you, and then I'm going to come back to you.
Hello. Hi, Marco Congiano, now with ODI Associate, formerly with the IMF. A warning, if I may, there's a lot of talk about involvement of private sector. These are risky investments. What we learn the hard way, private sector is pretty quick at moving out, but risk actually materialize. In my experience, countries are still not well equipped to handle what we call contingent liabilities. So before entering this field, I wish countries were really better prepared. I had mentioned the fiscal risk assessment. This is still a relatively new instruments. So I think countries should really kind of build a little bit of muscles before entering this game. So lots of work has been done on capturing contingent liabilities, particularly in DSA with brings me to my second comment. We've done a lot of work on the contingent liabilities. The very notion of fiscal risk is still relatively new, 30 years old, so it's still evolving. DSA has been improved on the liability side, not much on the asset side. So I wonder whether it's time to calculate, first of all, these debt ratios on a net basis. Only a couple of countries do that. They've convinced even the IMF. I believe it was Australia, Canada, and then maybe a few more. But I wonder whether it should be open, perhaps a conversation on try to measure what I would classify as contingent assets, because the rate of returns potentially could be very high, but it's contingent. So how do we match the liability and the asset side? I'm certainly not suggesting going full-blown accruals balance sheet, but a very basic asset registry. And last comment, that's why I'm remaining a little bit negative or skeptical, shall I say, on property taxes, because very few countries have actually a good handle on what they actually own, let alone manage. So those are my comments. Thank you.
The UK being one of those. Next door.
Good morning. Aliyu here from Liberia. Thank you. Very a good presentation. I just want to pick up from Debbie's point she made earlier about especially for low-income countries where the scope for private sector financing is really, really low. And that point has also been echoed by many of the panelists. I'd like to ask your thoughts on what can be done, for example, to increase, to have more grant financing for countries for poor countries, because eventually these are the countries that have the greatest fiscal stress. They do not have the financing available to put into core business of government, and now they have to spend on resilience and on adaptation. So what can be done to do that? And is there anything that countries themselves need to do to signal multilaterals to be able to provide, to channel more support to their interventions? And this is in light of the comments made yesterday by the keynote speaker, basically cautioning multilateral institutions like the IMF, World Bank, to consider more grant financing to these countries, because we see that there is an increasing level of loan financing coming to poor countries. And the second point is on I think Ed's point about robust institutions are very, very critical to resilience, to building resilience, and I agree with that 100%. But many of these countries, especially in poor, fragile countries, we know that institutions are not robust. So what pattern do you see in those countries in terms of dealing with their existing capacity challenges, and then with this additional layer of dealing with all of these climate issues? Do you see early successes, and what lessons are you learning from those successes for other countries to follow? Thank you.
Very interesting questions. So I'm going to ask for some more, but I'm going to just think about which questions you would like to answer, and then let me know when you can. Hans-Peter, you wanted to ask something? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Hans-Peter Lank is here with ODI. Very interesting questions. The issue about private sector, how much of a role can it play? I think the realities as you describe it in the adaptation field, it's probably quite limited. Blended finance, we shouldn't mix together the 1.3 trillion. The blended finance potential there is mostly, as Josue said, on the mitigation side. It's not going to be on the adaptation side. It's not going to be on the low-income country side, and that's all I think fairly clear. One area though, which to my mind is not really being exploited enough, is the municipal level. So the question of how we can build capacity at municipal level to finance adaptation investments. A lot of adaptation investments will have to happen at the municipal level. I don't know what the percentage is, Debbie, you might know. But a lot of that is in municipalities that today don't have financial capacity. They don't have a rating. I think only 4% of developing country municipalities have a credit rating, so they don't go to the market. I remember efforts, for instance, in Indonesia to create a municipal bond market, which are moving forward. Same in Southern Africa that the World Bank and others undertook. I remember efforts in Colombia on flood protection in municipalities, which worked very well. But they tend to take time. You need to build capacity. You need to build municipal capacity to charge for these things. It's a whole lot easier at the municipal level to charge, and so to build a financial model than it is at the national level for these kinds of adaptation investments. So the question is really, shouldn't there be much more of an effort to bring in the municipalities, build capacity, not just in national finance ministries, but at the municipal level to handle finance? We know this is going to be time consuming. This is not something that's going to happen within a year. Let's make a 10-year plan, but put some massive effort if we really want to make progress on the adaptation front.
Thank you very much. I've got, why don't we just keep the microphone on that row, and then there's also a lady here who wants to ask.
Thank you very much. My name is Falayinka, and I'm from a subnational government. So immediately you mentioned that I was happy. So I'm from Lagos, Nigeria, and we do have a Fitch rating. We're rated B. But one thing we have found is that it's very difficult for us to access finance at subnational levels. And as you've mentioned, a lot of the issues a lot of the climate-related issues actually happen or are addressed at subnational levels. And what I wanted to find out is from the reports that you have done, or from the assessments that you have done, how easy is it for us at subnational level to access finance from these various funds? For example, in Lagos, we've been trying to access the GCF fund for almost 2 years. And it has been one iteration after the other. And I can tell you that this is more than 2 years after, and we still haven't moved forward. So it's proposals go, and then comments come back. We want you to do it this way. We do it that way, and then something else happens. We go again, and they're like, oh, we want you to ask for more funds. You're not asking for enough funds. And a lot of times you keep wondering, is there criteria around the funding that is not public, that we're not aware of, but it's actually at the back end? Because the finance seems to be available, but it's difficult for us to actually access it. As in, so how do we make the funding easier for cities to actually access, even though we know that we still need to go through our national governments? And that's another conversation, because we've always have to, for the funds that are available, we always need a sovereign guarantee, which is difficult because some cities actually are able to access that funding better than other cities, even at the subnational level. So what's the fund looking at around that? Thank you.
That's really interesting experience. If the mic could come down here. Neha, I'm going to ask you specifically about access in the adaptation fund for municipalities, and probably also you, just in your experience of this. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Jane from Kenya. And listening to the conversation, I have always said that economists, you need to tweak your thinking to the social bit of this. When it comes to adaptation, we are basically dealing with the social fabric of communities, because it's communities that are affected by these adaptive and resilience social protection, interventions that we are talking about. So my question is, in terms of when you are doing your analytics, how is this resilience for communities linked to the national economic growth of of countries? And have we thought of developing a tool of trying to kind of analyze the nexus between this adaptability that we are talking about and the general economic growth of countries, both socially and economically? Thank you.
I've got one more person, or two. I'm going to take two more then. There's a person on the front row here. Oh, and if you've got the mic, yes, this guy here, and then it'll come back to Tom. It's you. Just those two, and then if you could think about what answers you would like to give. Please don't answer everything, but there's some things which are probably more relevant to you, and your answers panel are going to have to be quite short. Please, sir.
Okay, thank you. Just Sequinder Singh from the IMF, and there were a number
We're well represented here.
Yes, sorry about that.
No, we like it.
I wanted to make cover four points. On the DSA, I mean, you raised the issue of the extent to which climate has been incorporated into the DSAs. I mean, we have at the fund been certainly very conscious of incorporating climate shocks. The DSAs already had scope to incorporate large shocks into the simulations, and there were already scenarios around disaster, how to deal with natural disasters. We've issued an interim guidance note to our teams to incorporate climate shocks into the analysis. We've done some work where you can do climate shock stress testing, and we've even piloted climate shocks into DSAs. In particular, if you look at some of the work that we've done on Colombia and Peru, so it's certainly a work in progress. There's certainly more work to be done, and the IMF is doing this work. On your point on how do we think about the return on resilience investment? I mean, the big debate on DSAs in recent years has been, as countries needed to make critical public investment, are these DSAs restricting to borrowing? And so we thought a lot about the link between public investment, growth, and debt. And within that framework, we've developed a set of models where you can think about climate-related investments as well, the returns on that investment. And so there is quite a bit of work going on that. Second point I wanted to make was...
You're going to have to be very quick.
Very quickly.
I think you've had 2 points already out of the 4.
Sorry. Okay, very quickly. Debt for nature swaps. In the late 80s, these were very useful. If you go to Costa Rica these days, what Conservation International did in the late 80s in converting some of the secondary market debt into investments there, and the national parks there, it's an incredible success story. But, the sovereign debt problem in many of our countries, this only covers a very small part of the debt. It is part of the mechanism. Is it more effective than, say, climate conditional grants, for example? It's not a solution to some of the debt issues, but it certainly could be part of the suite of issues. And so we do cover that. RSF, we've dispersed 11 billion out of about 45 billion on the RSF. So and last, on capacity development, we've been doing a ton of work with countries all over the world on building their skills to incorporate climate into their macro frameworks, into their key institutions. The key issue that we found is that in many countries, climate was seen as an issue just for the finance ministry. It wasn't seen as a cross-cutting issue. So we brought people across different institutions together. And one of the reasons we've done that is so that they can access the capacity building fund resources that people like the Climate Fund, Green Climate Fund have to help them build the capacity to absorb some of their grants. Thank you very much.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you. Tom, is your question short?
Yeah, I'll try.
More importantly, are the answers likely to be short?
Unlikely.
Quickly then.
On national adaptation plans, Debbie, I was struck by, I think you said only 16% will be met by domestic resources. So my question is, what are these for? Because that makes, to me, that makes them sound like their shopping list to try and attract international finance. And we've just had a discussion about how all the funds are small, and we know that there's aid cuts and aid is declining. So given that we had a discussion as well, talking about how countries can kind of incorporate climate concerns into their public financial management processes, is there a problem with the kind of the plans that should be guiding investments in resilience are just not being fit for purpose? So what are these for? Can they be improved? And I guess to Ed, is there any experience in national adaptation plans being useful to help guide the kind of investments or the reforms selected in RSF programs as well? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're gonna come back to the panel. You have no idea, you in the audience, quite what's going on this little screen down here. This is a timer which was reset to fit the finish time, not the fact that we started 10 minutes late. So it now says 44 seconds left, 42. It's gone into the red zone, and we are all feeling under tremendous pressure here to speak for 15 seconds. So either guys just ignore it for a bit, or could it be reset so that we can allow the 10 minutes that we had that we lost at the beginning, just so that we don't feel quite so pressured, particularly me. So I'm going to just ask each of you to respond to the things you've heard. Please don't feel as if you have to respond to anything, to everything. Say the things that kind of feel most interesting. Joshua, I know you've got an extra thing you wanted to add to things you said earlier. Let's start with you, Ed. What's your thank you? It now says 10 minutes.
Oh, I feel so much more relaxed now.
It is, isn't it? Much more relaxed. But don't please take the 10 minutes. Just take the 2.
So maybe Marco's point, I think, is very well made about contingent liabilities. I mentioned the QCraft tool that we have worked on for climate risk assessment. We also have been working with countries all over the world on a range of other fiscal risk tools, looking at things like contingent liabilities from SOEs, from guarantees, from public-private partnerships. So I think we are definitely seeing an improved capacity and awareness of the issues. I think there's a way to go in the follow through on that and in how that information is used. But I think we are beginning to see an enhanced capacity within finance ministries. And the second question, I think, is on the question about which institutions are we seeing improvement in. I think when it comes to climate public investment, we definitely see more reflection of climate issues in the frameworks on paper. So things like coordination, how decision-making structures are set up across government, how structures are in place between central government and subnational government, I think is definitely improved. And also we do see more thinking about risk, as I mentioned earlier, thinking about risk, which is one of the dimensions we look at in the public investment management assessment. Where we see more, I guess, reds in our framework is around this point that Tom just raised around plans and the realism of plans. So when we look at a public investment management assessment, basically every country we go to has some kind of a national development strategy, and many of them have now reflected NDCs and national adaptation plans. What we see, unfortunately, is a break in the link between strategies and what actually happens on the fiscal side and the budgetary framework. So there's a way to go there, and there's a way to go as well on actually following through in the budget on, we've got lots of tagging systems, but actually mapping how and tracking how expenditure compares to initial plans and assessing the causes of that, and actually using that information to inform decision making is a way to go.
Great. Josue has another appointment, which is now that we're over time. Do you want to come back on some of the issues that were asked here, and I think the point you were making about implementation of your own report?
It's just that my other appointment hasn't been reset, so that's why. Look, I'll just take the municipal question, since it was asked by 2 people sitting next to each other. So look, I can only give the headlines, right? But I think there are 3 levels of action, or 3, perhaps I mention action because these are in a way the 3 main issues, at least the way I look at it. One is the lack of articulation between national and local levels, right? In climate questions, for example. You look at NDCs, very few NDCs actually have, a meaningful local element to them. So if you look top down, that's a bit of an issue, right? Because it ends up like climate is, a national issue and the local. And the problem is that when we're talking about adaptation and resilience, well, cities are actually the front end of this question, right? We say that the solutions have to be local. Well, then what does that mean, right? So that's the first issue in terms of the planning, but also of the finance, right? That, you still have in many countries, the difference between the national level and, the linkage between them, is very limited. The second point on capacity, okay, I won't go long, but many of the questions we discuss on capacity at national are replicated at local, and sometimes even more, right? Because the means, are even more limited. And the third one is to say that in terms of quote unquote international external finance support, the system tends to be biased to national, right? And doesn't interact well. So this applies a bit, to the MDBs, although I have my ex-colleague from EBRD. So, okay, we did work on trying to have, non-sovereign lending to cities working directly. But the system as a whole is still a national-oriented system, including the funds therefore some of the pains, that you have to go through. So these are the three categories on the municipal. And just to close on the previous comments about the funds, for those of you who are very interested in this topic, you can look at the report. It has an incredibly nerdy annex, which goes into all the actions that these funds should take between 2025 and 2027, right? And actually, there is progress, right, on it. But again, there is progress, but no time. So I'll...
If you need to leave the stage,
Yes,
please do. Debbie, do you want to come back on some of the points that you feel particularly interested?
The purpose of the NAPs, and sorry, it was the NDCs. I misspoke there. It was the NDCs. And just as a reminder, the NDCs, National Determined Contributions, are mandated out of Paris. Each country has to develop an NDC to say how it will deliver the Paris objectives around mitigation and adaptation. So countries have to do them. They are important and they do kind of set an ambition level. And I think it's important to say that there was a very important principle in the Framework Convention and in the Paris agreements around common but differentiated responsibilities, which mean that those who cause the crisis bear the primary responsibility for dealing with it, which means that developing countries should not be paying for a problem they did not cause. So that's a key principle, and the International Court of Justice reinforced that principle in their advisory opinion that came out in July of this year. So it's really important to say that it's not the job of all developing countries to pay for all their adaptation and mitigation costs. Developed countries need to provide the funding to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, which is a legally binding document. So in practice, what does that mean? At COP30, there is quite a lot of momentum now building on a new adaptation finance commitment to replace the Glasgow one, which is just running out. So it'd be great if developing countries prioritize that, really, really push for that. It's going to be hard to get that, I'm not going to lie, but nonetheless, it's really important that that momentum continues. And on the developed countryside, it is a tricky environment right now, but there are things that can be done. So polluter pays taxes. There's a coalition of solidarity levies that's looking into all this stuff, and also ending production subsidies for fossil fuel production, which also the ICJ said it may be an internationally wrongful act, and G7 countries have signed up to for years anyway. So really important that's an opportunity where progress can be made straight away on how to, and that can be funneled towards adaptation and climate finance.
Great. Neha, I'm going to just ask you if there's anything in 1 minute max that you want to add to this, particularly in defense of your approach to municipal authorities.
I want to support what was said, and what we're finding in all of these adaptation projects is the sustainability aspect really depends at that local level, at the municipal level, because once that intervention is completed, to really continue the momentum, for example, the operation and maintenance of infrastructure really falls at that municipal level. So it's a very critical level to build that capacity, provide that technical assistance. We don't have implementing entities, although there's nothing technically preventing that. So let's have a conversation on what might be some of the barriers there, but we have multiple executing entities at the municipal level. We have them in Malaysia and South Africa and Tanzania and several countries in Western Balkans. So we have quite a good support from executing entities at the municipal level. But we could chat further on what the barriers might be for the implementing entity part.
Thank you very much. Patricia, you have the last word.
And I would just want to respond to the lady from Kenya, though she stepped out, where she asked how is resilience linked to the social fabric of society. As you can see, ministries of finance are becoming more inclusive. I am the social safeguard and gender expert. So I deal with ensuring that the climate financing approach or programming and projects are gender and socially inclusive. So dealing with the social fabric of the society, that's straightforward. So just to let her know that. Yeah, but also our national climate finance strategy prioritizes alignment of financing on resilience, aligning all public or private financing with resilience, inclusivity. The key word is inclusivity and sustainable development. So we are not just macro modeling figures, we are linking the figures to the actual humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. And we didn't get, if anybody's wondering, I have been checking my pad here. We didn't get any questions from the online audience. Thank you very much, to the panelists, really interesting contributions to the very helpful contributions on the floor. This conversation is clearly not ended. There is a lot to discuss here, and this is a field which is in constant development. So I hope we will come back to this in future conferences. Thank you very much. That is the end of this session, and we have 25 seconds left. So I will give myself a pat on the back for it's actually now down to 19, which is a bit of a problem. Thank you all very much. Look forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.